Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Bava Basra, Daf Kuf Mem Tes, and we will be going up to Daf Kuf Nun, Amud Aleph, halfway down. And then I will not be here on Shabbos. I'll be in the neighborhood, but Baruch Hashem, we're celebrating a Simcha in our family. My sister's son's Ufruf, so we'll be with our family on Shabbos. I won't be here. So Rabbi Handler will be teaching the Shabbos. The next Shabbos I'll be in New York for Shabbos Shabbat Brachos. Rabbi Handler will be teaching that Shabbos also. But it's a lot of Shabbos, Baruch Hashem. We're starting about 9 lines or so, 8 or 9 lines from the bottom of Kuf Mem Ches Amud Beis, and we're still in the midst of the sugyas that are discussing the Matnas Shchid Meira. So the Gemara wants to know, Yibayalahu, first words on the line, Yibayalahu, Hiktish Kol Nechasav Amad Mahu. Let's say a person's on his deathbed, and he feels that he's about to die, and he's makdish everything he owns, and then he stands up, code word for he's healed. Miraculously, medicinally, whatever the case may be, he's fine now. Says the Gemara, Mi Amrina Hiktish Kol Nechasav. If he's makdish everything, what happens? Mi Amrina and Kol Legabe Hektish Gamar Umakni. Do we say that while maybe in general a Matnas Shchid Meira is retractable, provided that he was Amad, that he was healed? Or no, do we say that because it's Hektish in this case, it's Gamar Umakni, the transaction is final? Because you can't give something to Hektish and then recant. Oh, Dilma, Kol Legabe Nafshe Lo Gamaru Makni. Or maybe because it has to do with him, it's not considered a full kinyan. Namely, he obviously wouldn't have made the kinyan at all if he would have known that he was going to become healed. And because the impact was directly on him, even though he did what was Makdish to Hektish, we would still say that Lo Gamaru Makni. And similarly, Hifkir kol nechasav mahu. Let's say he didn't bring it to Hektish, but he was mafkir it. Mi amrinan keva de'af la'anim ke'ashirim gamaru makni. That since when it comes to hefker, there's a very high darga in that when you're mafkir, anyone is allowed to take it. It's not earmarked for a specific group, so therefore the kinyan should be final. Odilma kol legabe nafshe lo gamaru umakni. But no, if he were to have been healed because it negatively impacts him, we would have said maybe there's no kinyan. Or another case, all of which will end in teku, 5 lines from the bottom, kuf mem ches mid beis. Chile kol nechasav la'aniyimai. Let's say that a person was mechalek all of his properties to poor people. Mi amrinan tzedakah vaday megamer vaday migmar gomaru makni. That when a person is giving tzedakah, their mindset is to give tzedakah. Do we say that? Or dilma kol legabe nafshe lo gamaru makni. But since when he heals, it will negatively impact him. So perhaps under those circumstances, we would then assume that it's lo gamar makni. To all of these questions, the answer is teku. We don't know the answer to these questions. And some of them are not even so far off. We could understand a person saying that on their deathbed, I hereby give all of my money to tzedakah, and then he heals. That's not so crazy. That's not so crazy. So these are real shilas, and I presume they do happen. Skipping the parentheses, 2 lines from the bottom. On a similar note, Amar of Sheshes, if Shchiv Meira says yitol, he says you should take something, or he says v'yizke, you should merit something, v'yachzik, you should make a chazak of a yikne. Kulan, if a Shchiv Meira says this language, any of these 4 languages, kulan lashon matanahin. They're all begeder lashon matana. That makes it very different than the world of Yerusha, because the matana is going to be binding no matter what. The Masnisa Tana, and in the Mishnah we have similarly that there are certain languages that are fitting for a Shchiv Meira to use. The Masnisa Tana af Yachasin v'Yaras, languages of Yerusha. If he said it, if the Shchiv Meira said it to a person who was Beroi Liyorsho, then that would be totally fine. That would work. I can say Lashon of Yerusha to someone who's one of my next of kin. And this is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Berokahi, who we saw earlier, that as long as you are including someone who's your next of kin, and you use a language of Yerusha, so then it's Chal. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka's shita was, you don't have to specifically go in order. You can stipulate who you want it to go to. You don't want it to go to the boys, you can let it go to the girls. And he said that you can make those caveats. So perhaps that's what's happening over here, with Av Yachzin V'Yaras, that according to Yochanan ben Baroka, as long as you're going to be giving it to someone who's next of kin, you're good to go. Last 2 words on the page for Kuf Mem Chesim Bezi Bayaluhu. Gemara says we have another question. What if he says Yehane Bahen? I want you to benefit from it. That's what the Shchiv Meira says to the recipient. Mahu. Do we say Denahabe Kulhu Matana Ka'amar? Odilma, last Nehumi Nahu Midi Ka'amar. Does it mean that the whole thing is a matana, or that only part of it is a matana because you should benefit from it. I want you to benefit from my house. What does that mean? Does it mean that I own your house? Yira bahen. I want you to see it. Mahu yamod bahen. I want you to stand in it. Mahu yishan bahem. I want you to lean on it. Mahu teku. All of these cases as well remain unclear and undetermined from our Gemara. This brings us to another aspect of the discussion of a matnas chimera. Says the Gemara, what happens if on his deathbed he is selling that which is his? If a person sells, al shchimera sells all of his nechasim, what would the din be? Amar Yehuda Marav, im amad eino chozer. If the person heals, we are not going to be chozer, the kinyan is chal. That means that your mechira is not, it doesn't have the same rules as the matnas chimera in regards to the capacity to go back to status quo. Your mechira in the shchimera state is not like a matnas shchimera and eino chozer. V'zimnin, sometimes Amar Yehuda Marav im amar chozer. In other cases, we see a stira where Yehuda Marav would say that you are chozer. So that's just talking out of both sides of your mouth. Do we say that when a shchimera did a mechira on his deathbed, do we say that it's binding in eino chozer, or do we say that no, because he healed, it is chozer? It says the Gemara below pligi. This isn't actually a contradiction. Ha deisnahu lezuze be'einaihu, ha depar inhu bechovo. When we say that it's eino chozer, when we say that a matnas chimera, which was sold mechira, when we say that there was a mechira and it's eino chozer, that's talking in a case where he already gave the money to the other person. But when we say that he can be chozer, that's the isnu lezuze be'einaihu. So let's just say it outside. A person says upon death they're going to sell all their property, but I still have all the property in my possession, so then I can be chozer on that. If the person's going to be amad, then the person can be chozer. That brings us to yet another kasha. Iboilahu shchiv meira shehode mahu. If there is a shchiv meira that admitted that a certain property belonged to a particular person. So he's on his deathbed. He says, "You're right. 123 Main Street belongs to Shmelki." So does that work? Does him saying that this it's not matnas shchimera? Again, of course, we're just dealing with iterations of what matnas shchimera could look like. But over here, what we're seeing is if a shchimera admits on his deathbed that this property really belongs to a third party, so does that work? And then the Gemara says Tashma and tells a crazy story. The Isur Giora. There was a man whose name was Isur, and he was a ger, so they called him Isur Giora. Now, Isur Giora, when he was a goy, he took Shmuel's daughter Rachel captive and violated her, and she conceived and had a child. And that child's name was Mar Bered Rachel. And we've seen this in Shas before, this rare reference where a person is named his name, Mar, the son of the mother. Mar Bered Rachel. Rachel was Shmuel's daughter. So this guy, Isur Giora, he was a goy, and he violated Shmuel's daughter Rachel, and she conceived, and she had Mar. And Havale, Trey Sar Alfe Zuze Gabe Zuze Be Rava. And this guy Isur could run into some money. The money that he had was in the house of Rava, not related. It's just in the house of Rava. Rav Mari Bere, Rav Mari, the son of Isur Giora, Horaso Shelo Bektusha. When he was conceived, it was Shelo Bektusha. Veledaso Bektusha Havai. And by the time Mar Bered Rachel was born, Isur had already gone through a giur. Could you imagine what an uncomfortable scenario that is? Having this guy davening in shul with his non-halachic son, because he was conceived of while the father was a goy. Ubei Rav Hava. And the Gemara says that Isur became a shchiv meira, and here's what happened. Omar Rava Hechi Nikninhu Rav Mari Lahani Zuzi. It doesn't make sense. The person Isur Giora was the biological father, but because he was a ger, he wasn't the halachic father. So there's no real Yerusha there. Yerusha requires a blood lineage. It doesn't just require a biological lineage. It requires a halachic blood lineage. So Rava said, what type of transaction would move the Yerusha of Isur Giora into his biological son's property, who is Mar Bered Rachel? He says as follows, Ibi Yerusha If you want to say that the mechanics of the transaction between Isur Giora and Mar Berei de Rachel is Yerusha, La Bar Yerushahu. He's not allowed to do that. The Yerusha principle doesn't apply to Mar Berei de Rachel because he's not halachically the son of this man who was his father. Ibimatana, if you want to say that while Isur Giora was dying, that he was giving over a gift, well, matna shchimera kirusha shavyo rabbanon. A matana on the deathbed is the same thing as a Yerusha, and just like Mar Berei de Rachel is not shaykh by Yerusha, so too he's not shaykh by matana. And extending this din, anyone who's shaykh by Yerusha is shaykh by matana, and kolecha delese b'Yerusha lese b'matana. So obviously, Isur Giora couldn't give over the Yerusha to Mar Berei de Rachel through the mechanisms of Yerusha and matana. What about Mashicha? Even Mashicha, if Mar Berei de Rachel was going to go to his biological father and say, fine, I'll just do Mashicha, that won't work because where did we say the money was? We said Les Nugabe, the money wasn't by the father. We said it was by Rava. Ibe Chalipin, if you want to say he did a Kenyan Chalipin, Ein Matbeya Nikne Bechalipin, you're not allowed to use the mechanism, the tool of Chalipin in regards to a coin. And Iagav Karka, and if you want to say that there's some degree of Karka over here, that Isur Giora was giving over to Mar Berei de Rachel, Lesle Ara. He didn't have any land to give over. So that also doesn't work. We've tried 4 or 5 options now, and here's the last one. Even Maimad Shlashtan, Yishalach lo Azilna. And says Rava that if you want to say that the transaction that's going to happen that will allow for Mar Berei de Rachel to take the Yerusha from his non-halachic but biological father Isur Giora is Maimad Shlashtan, where Rava, Isur Giora, and Mar Berei de Rachel would stand in a triangle together and speak. So says the Gemara, Shalach lo Azilna. Rava says, I'm not going to go. So maybe in theory that would work, but no dice because Rava is not willing. So in short, let's just step out of the weeds for just a moment. We asked about 6 or 7 small questions, but the bigger question is, how is it possible for a biological son who is not a halachic son because the father is a ger, he's a ger after the mother conceived. How is it possible for him to give a Yerusha to his son? Matana doesn't work, Yerusha doesn't work, Chalipin doesn't work, Mashicha doesn't work, and Mamad Shlashtan won't work, and there's no karka. So says the Gemara, Maskif lo Rav Ika Berei de Rav Ami Amai. Why are you even asking all of this? V'lo di Isser de Halein Zuze de Rav Marininhu v'likninhu be'odisa. Maybe what we can do, suggests Rav Ika Berei de Rav Ami, is just have the father be modeh, is just have the father Isser Giora say, this property simply doesn't belong to me. Remember, that was the question that we started with a third of the way down. We said, Shchiv meira shaho demahu. If a Shchiv meira were to just simply say, I know I never owned this property or I don't own this property, it belongs to somebody else, that should work. So according to this question of Rav Ika Berei de Rav Ami, we can see that this is in fact the answer. So therefore, the Shchiv meira is allowed to say, this property belongs to person X. I'm modeh to you. I'm admitting to you that it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to somebody else. We're 5 lines from the bottom of Kuf Mem Tes Amud Aleph. So we see from Rav Ami that it is possible to transfer ownership of a Yerusha from this father, the biological father, who again was not the halachic father because he's a ger, and that in fact works. Adahachi, while this suggestion of Rav Ika Berei de Rav Ami was being thrown around the base medrash, Nafak Udisa Mebei Isur. There was an announcement, an admittance that came out of the house of Isur. Namely, what did Isur Giora do? He said, I am hereby modeh that this property belongs to my biological son, though not my halachic son, Mar Berei de Rachel. And Ikbid Rava. Rava was very upset. Why was Rava upset? Because Rava had money in his pocket from a ger, from what it was given to him as a non-Jew. If these transactions wouldn't have worked out, the money would have ended up in the property of Rava. So Rava was upset. Ikbid Rava, Amar, kamagamre ta'anasa inchi umifsidili. You're coming up with all these tainas, and I'm the one who's going to lose out. So let's review the case, and then we will move on to the top of Kuf Mem Tes Mid Beis. We're dealing with a case where a man a man impregnated a woman. He was a goy when he did so. She was a yid. And then before the baby was born, the father became a ger. That's a pretty big rapid turnaround considering he violated her. So he did this whole turnaround, he became a ger. And then when the father, Yisur Giora, was on his deathbed, he wanted to bequeath whatever he had to his biological son who wasn't his halachic son. So how does it work? So the short answer is this last part of the Amud, the bottom 2/3 of this page was discussing this one idea that one is, yes, affirmative, allowed to say, I admit that this belongs to somebody else, and then halachically that works, and that counts as a transfer. That for an adopted family also? What? Yeah. I mean, obviously, this case is not the same, right? But yeah, I mean, they're definitely not halachically father-son. I mean, it's a very sensitive topic. I don't mean to speak crassly, but but in dry terms, they're not related. Right? So then if he wants to bequeath, the halachos of Yerusha don't apply. If the halachos of Yerusha don't apply, then the halachos of Matana don't apply as a shchiv meira. Only as you can give a Matana, but not as a shchiv meira. The special effects of a shchiv meira where he can say, I hereby am yoresh to person X, that does not work on a biological child who isn't a halachic child. So, no problem at all. We're only speaking in the frame of a shchiv meira. So we're talking about the throes of death, let's call it the last 60 seconds. I hereby give everything to, it doesn't work, Pasha. It just doesn't work. The mechanics don't work. The son does not own anything that the father says in those last moments, if he's not a halachic son. It's hefker.
So that I remember talking about it. I don't remember what we said is what happens if somebody dies without any Russian? What happens to his estate?
It's hefker. If a ger dies with no yorshim,
no, not a ger, anybody.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
I presume. What is supposed to happen with all that money?
Right.
I mean, you'd have to be a loner of loners. You'd have to have like literally nobody around you, and it would be a rare scenario because the next of kin pecking order is pretty long. You're going generations down, generations up, and generations lateral, like at each level. It would be. We don't, Baruch Hashem, most people don't live their lives like that. There are people who were only children and their parents were only children, and then everybody died but him. That can happen. It happens. But
no, it happens, but not.
It happens. It's not very common in families that have birthing rates like ours because there's so many lateral siblings in the average. It's 4 or 5, whatever the number is in the average family. Just makes it rare to have those scenarios. But yes, I believe, I could be wrong. Certainly by a ger, it's true. By a ger, it's true even if he has children of his own. He's a ger. He's not as long as the children were going. But if he had his own kids after. No, I'm saying if a goy has children and then becomes a ger,
they're still whatever they were.
They're goy.
Right.
Yeah. So then I believe his property is still hefker. I don't know. Presume.
Let me see the color here.
He has to go through a gerus process. He has to go through gerus. So the gerus process has 3 steps. It's a Kabbalah mitzvos that a man has to, and the first 2 apply to men and women. You have to go through a process where you agree to keep the corpus of Jewish law. The second step is the mikvah, and the third step for a man is circumcision, obviously, which, of course, if you're already circumcised, it's a poke. It's hatafas dambris, no bracha, poke, go jump in the mikvah.
There's no age limitation.
Not on the higher end, but on the lower end, to do it as a katan, so there are caveats that are built in, which is that once he becomes a bar mitzvah, or if she becomes a bas mitzvah, so in theory, you're allowed to recant in those early moments of being you don't have to be asked about it. If you're passive, then you are Jewish. But if you are just waiting for that moment, I'm 13 and one day, I'm done, I'm out, then you're not Jewish anymore. Because the binding moment is when you become a bar chiyuva, when you become on the upper side, there's no upper limit. Yeah. I mean, the only real gradations on a Torah level is katan and gadol. There's not really aren't a lot of other gradations. I just had some complicated phone conversations today about this, about one of the reasons why other movements, why Orthodoxy struggles to accept conversions of other movements is because of one of the 3 building blocks of gerus, which is what is your standard for keeping Jewish law. So if you say I'm gonna convert, but I'm gonna drive on Shabbos, you're not Jewish. That's an Isser D'Oraisa. You can't build into your Judaism that you can be human and struggle, no problem. That's not what we're talking about. But if you bake into your gerus that I drive on Shabbos, you don't have any sources to support you on that. Then you're just not Jewish.
Undone with Mafreya, meaning he's fine for 10 years, right? And then he decides he's not going to be Shomer Shabbos.
No, it doesn't. I spoke to Rabbi Reese about this because there was a gerus that took place in the CRC, and I was connected to them. I asked Rabbi Reese, what percentage of women who convert don't cover their hair? He said 5% don't cover their hair after a gerus. That's what he told me. He said it in the flip. He said 95% of women cover their hair.
I'm surprised.
So I know two couples. I know two women who went through the gerus process and they don't cover their hair. Now again, even that, do we say that not covering your hair is enough of a violation of Jewish law that you haven't reached the threshold of I keep Jewish law in order to convert?
I mean, does Israel apply?
No, because the problem is that, and I'm speaking a little like without proper sources here, but the problem is that a gerus requires that you basically agree to keep everything, but you're human, so if you struggle, no problem. That's kind of the measure. But if someone says, I'm still going to put on makeup, I can't give that up. I don't know. They're very delicate shilas. What?
So it can be.
You can't undo it 10 years later. That you cannot do.
So
but if you started that way as a Machal Shabbos, then you weren't a Yid in the first place.
So
there's no backsies. Once you're in, you're in. Yeah. Okay. Right on the top of Kuf Mem Testament Beis, this is one of the rare moments where there are so many sets of two dots in Shas. Here they forgot to put one in. This is a two dots section, namely that it's part of a Mishnah. The Gemara says on the top of Kuf Mem Testament Beis, shiur karka kolshu matnaso kayemes. That if a little bit of karka was left over, then his matana is kayam. You see the little aleph there on the side. I don't know if your Gemara has it. Mine certainly does. It says shiur karka kolshu matnaso kayemes. He piska. It is considered a quote from the Mishnah. V'tziun ha-Mishnah. V'chaseros ha-nekudos. The two dots are missing. The reason why that's insightful is because that was written by the Rashash who lived a while ago, which means that it's not just us who have the two dots. Like we've been using this language for our whole lives. At the two dots. So were the early Achronim. It's not a new thing. It's just been used for a while. Just an interesting historical note. The Kama Kolshu, when we say that a little bit of karka is left over, that it's still going to be a binding transaction. What is Kolshu? So Amar Yehuda Marav karka k'dei parnasa. So it's a small amount of karka, enough that will be mefarnes you, that will support your family. Rav Yirmiyah argues and says, Amar metaltalin k'dei parnasa. He says it's not just karka, it's even metaltalin, which is difficult because our Mishnah said karka. We'll ask that question soon. So these are the two shitas of Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav and Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Abba in regards to the shiur of kolshu. One is that it's the shiur of k'dei parnasa, and the other is that it would still be true even if it wasn't karka, but it was metaltalin. Amar Reb Zera, 4 lines down. Kama mechavnon shmaitza desabi. Look how accurate the comments of the great ones are. So the Gemara says, I don't know what you're talking about. It says the Gemara, karka taimumai, the ikoi samechalei. The reason by karka, why we say if there's any karka kolshu that it's still a matana, because the ikoi samechalei, that if he were to get better, he would be able to be somech on this. He'd be able to support himself. Metaltalin nami ikoi samechilavayu. By metaltalin also, he would be able to use that to support himself. Maskiv law, Rav Yosef. Well, what do you say? Umay chavanasa. Why are you saying that they're being so accurate? They're not so accurate at all, and here's why. Manda amar metaltalin. According to the second shita, which was the shita of Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Baraba, how could you say that metaltalin are a replacement for karka? It's karka tnan. The Mishnah calls it karka. So how in the world could you say that? And man damar k'dei parnasaso. According to the one who says that it's k'dei parnasaso, well, it says kolshu it's not. So how can you, going back to Rabbi Yehuda Marav in the second line, how can you say that the shiur of a kolshu is k'dei parnasaso? It's kolshu tnan. A kolshu is a very tiny amount. So Amar le Abaye v'chol heicha detani karka dafka. Just because a Mishnah uses the word karka doesn't mean that that's the only option. And I'll prove it to you, says the Gemara, as we'll see as we wrap up to the top of the next page. V'atznan, we have a Mishnah, one that we've seen a couple of times. If a man, a master, a Rav, were to write over all of his properties to an Eved, the halacha is that the Eved would go free. Shiur karka kol shehu. If there was any amount left over, then lo yatsa ben chorin, because the karka is like an Eved, and because we don't know what part of his property he intended to not sell, because it was a shiur, he left something over, so therefore lo yatsa ben chorin. Reb Shimon Omer, le'olam hu ben chorin, ad she'omar kol nechasai nesulun leploni avdi chutz me'echad miribo shebahen. Says the Gemara that it's always going to be the case that that the Eved will be a ben chorin until he says all my properties are given to another person, to Ploni Avdi, except for 1/10,000. And now, turning to the top of Kuf Nun Amud Aleph, we can now see the end of Abaye's argument. Amar Rav Dimi bar Yosef, Amar Rav Elazar, asu metaltalin shiur eitzel Eved. Look at this. We see that the word metaltalin is being used interchangeably with an Eved, but an Eved is like karka. So what do we see? That the language of karka is lav dafka. And then lastly, though this is not where our question comes from, this is a side din that we don't allow metaltalin to be a shiur, to be a leftover as it relates to ksuba. Either way, the question has been posed that, or I should say it's a stark comment, which is that we see that karka is not always a language that's dafka, perhaps it's metaltalin. And if that's true, then the comment that we saw of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba on the top of Daf Kuf Mem Testament Beis is very reasonable. It says the Gemara as follows. We're on Kuf Nun Amud Aleph, 3 lines down. Hasam b'dinhu deloles nikarka. Really, the Mishnah that we quoted at the very, very top line of Kuf Mem Testament Beis, it really didn't need the word karka in there at all. V'adi detana reisha, because in the beginning it said karka. Where did it say in the beginning that there was karka? Quote, Rabbi Kiva Omer karka kol shuch ebes b'peu v'bikurim. When there is any karka at all, as even a shiur of a kol shuhu, it's chayiv in peah and in bikurim v'lichtav alem pruzbal. You'd have to write a pruzbal v'liknos iman nechasin shein lamachras bekesev v'ushtar b'chazaka. All the regular halachos apply over there. Now over there, because we needed to speak about karka, because we were talking about things that are karka. That's what he says. Karka kol shechevs b'peah mishumachik tani karka over here, but really karka was lav dafka. And then the Gemara now presses on the phrase kolshu. V'chol hecha detani kolshu les la shiura. Everywhere, in every case, the tani kolshu, where we use the language of a kolshu, that doesn't mean that there's a shiur. That doesn't mean that the chachamim were not mechuvan. They were very mechuvan. Where do we see that even a kolshu has a shiur? We're 10 lines down on Kuf Nun Amud Aleph, learning just a few more lines until the 2 dots. V'atznan, Reb Dosa ben Horkanis Amar, chamesh v'chelos gozezos mana upras. Says the Gemara that when we talk about the mitzvah of Reishis HaGeiz, of giving over the first shearings to a Kohen, the halacha is that it has to be that each one gives 1.5 pras to a mana of 1.5 per animal. Chayavos b'Reishis HaGeiz. V'chachamim omrim, I disagree with you. Chamesh v'chelos goes as those kol shein. It doesn't have to be that volume. It could be even a kol shein. And says the Gemara, and here's where we see that a kol shein, a kol shehu is a very flexible term. V'amrinan, the kama kol shein. Amarav, mana upras. He held a little differently. He held that the total was mana upras for all 5 of the animals, not 1.5 for each animal. But it has to be broken up into equal portions of fifths, which is 0.3 per animal. So here we see that a kol shehu is a totally reasonable thing to have a shiur connected to it. That was like the original line of Reb Zera. Reb Zera said 4 lines down on Kuf Mem Testament Beis, Kama mechavnan shmait sadasabe. They were so accurate. So says the Gemara, where we are a third of the way down on Kuf Nun Amud Aleph, Hasam bedinu delo lisni kolshu. Really, in regards to that case, the word kolshu shouldn't even be a phrase, but only because va'adi the Kamar Tanakama shiur rabba, only because the Tanakama, in regards to Reishis HaGeiz, gave a huge shiur, 1.5 per animal, which is a lot. So therefore, Tanakama shiur rabba. Therefore, Amar ihu nami shiur zutra karila kolshu. It didn't really need to be kolshu. He was just saying it's a much smaller shiur. So what we've done in these last 20 lines or so is verify the sheet of Reb Zera, who said Kama mechavnan shmaitza desabi. He pointed out that number one, that the language of karka was lav dafka, and he pointed out that kolshu can sometimes come with a shiur as well. We'll stop right here at the 2 dots. On Shabbos, Rabbi Reuven Handler will be taking over starting right here, and wishing you all a beautiful Shabbos.